Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It's a real delight to see so many people here, and I think that we even have an overflow room. So this is clearly an exciting topic that has generated a lot of interest. Let me first introduce myself before I introduce others. My name is Laura Arricchio, and I have the good fortune to be the Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies here at the New School for Public Engagement. And the program in environmental studies, the undergraduate program in environmental studies, is one of the interdisciplinary programs that I have the good fortune to work with. So I am absolutely delighted to be here tonight at this particular event, which is one that really operates at the intersection of the New School's commitment to environmental and social justice. And these are really key themes throughout the entire university, not only in programs that are specifically devoted to them, but really topics that we address throughout many of our courses and public programming. In particular, environmental justice and food justice are a core part of the work of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, as well as an important part of the curriculum of our food studies program. And the food studies program, by the way, is going to launch a major this coming fall. And you will please have to forgive me this evening because there's actually another food studies event going on tonight at this same very moment. So I'm actually going to dash out at some point in the middle of the event, and it's not going to be out of any disrespect intended to the panelists or the audience or the organizers. It's just that I can't actually manage to be two places at once. So I'll be going from this food event to that food event, which is actually quite a lovely way to spend my evening. The New School and faculty are committed to working with activists through action research, civic engagement projects, and student internships with our partner organizations. And so for this reason, the organizers of this event realized that this project needs to be developed with and for activists. And so this evening's discussion actually focuses on that question of how researchers and activists can best work together to support efforts to dismantle oppression and increase social justice in our city and, of course, in the world beyond. So let me just very briefly introduce our two wonderful organizers of this evening's event. First, Kristen Reynolds is a food systems researcher and educator focused on advancing social justice in the food system. She holds a PhD in geography, which is my favorite. If I ever were to go back to grad school, it would be for geography. It's one of my favorite, most fascinating fields. She holds a PhD in geography and a master's degree in international agricultural development from the University of California, Davis, and bachelor's degrees in international soil and crop sciences and French, which is quite the combination, I have to say, from Colorado State University. Here, she was a co-author with our other organizer, a co-author of 5 Borough Farm, Seeding the Future of Urban Agriculture in New York City, which was published in 2012. She currently teaches courses about urban agriculture, food systems, and action research at the New School for Public Engagement, and her courses involve projects co-designed with community farm partners in New York. And this tonight's event comes from some of the research that she is currently working on with Nevin. Nevin Cohen, our other co-organizer this evening, is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies, where he teaches courses in urban food systems, environmental studies, environmental planning, and environmental policy analysis, including cross-disciplinary courses that connect urban policy, planning, and design. And his research really focuses on the development of urban food policy, the use of urban space for food production, and many other related topics. He's been involved with food policy development in New York City, and he also co-authored the very same book, project, 5 Borough Farm. He's currently working on 2 book projects, a study of urban food policymaking in the US and Canada, and Beyond the Kale, which is, by the way, one of the single best titles for any event or book that I have ever encountered. And just to round out his bio, he has a PhD in urban planning from Rutgers University and a master's in city and regional planning from Berkeley and a BA from Cornell. So we have a remarkably diversified set of colleagues here who are able to bring together just some amazingly unique skills and perspectives. And I think that's really what makes this program, and hopefully this evening, a really special one. So thank you to both of them, and they will introduce their panelists.
We'll be co-presenting and sharing the mic, going back and forth.
Yes. So thank you very much, Dean Riccio. So before we begin our short presentation tonight, we definitely want to thank our number of supporters. First of all, this event itself is made possible through a grant from the New School Public Engagement, Civic Engagement Foundation grant. Also a small grant from the Merck Family Fund and the Lucius and Eva Eastman Foundations to support this event. We also want to make sure that we thank our graduate student research assistants, Catherine Naring. You may have seen some of her emails coming through, who's a master's student here at the New School, and Stephen McCutcheon-Rubio, who's a master's student at NYU. We also want to thank Brandon Fisher, who is our environmental studies program manager, helped us again with organizing, and of course, our urban agriculture and food systems friends and colleagues, and those who have participated in the various research projects that we've been involved in the last couple of years. And I actually did just feel compelled to point out that Nevin and I were both involved with Five Borough Farm, but so were some of our panelists here tonight. So we very much see our work as one that is collaborative with people that are doing work on the ground and in the community. And so when we first started organizing the event, we had a number of people that we wanted on the panel, and we just kept adding people and adding people. And so this means that it's hard for us to do a full introduction of everybody if we want to actually get to the substance of our conversation. So you'll find in the papers that you picked up a sheet with everybody's full bios that I encourage you to read and understand in greater depth what these amazing people do in their communities and in their institutions. So that said, very briefly, on our panel tonight we have Maggie Cheney from EcoStation New York and the Bushwick Campus Farm down in the end. Ray Figueroa from Friends of Brook Park and the New York City Community Gardening Coalition. Isabel Contento from Teachers College at Columbia University and the Tisch Center for Food Education and Policy. We got it wrong in the program. Yonette Fleming from the Hattie Carthen Community Garden and Urban Farm and Hattie Carthen Community Market. Leticia Alanis from La Union in Sunset Park. Odalis Diaz-Pinheiro from Hostos Community College in the South Bronx. And finally, Nick Freudenberg from Hunter College and the New York City Food Policy Center. So welcome and thank you very much for sitting on our panel tonight. So now to get into our presentation, we first wanted to point out that we had a lot of emails congratulating us on the publication of our book, Beyond the Kale. And in fact, we are still finishing the manuscript, and it won't be published for till the end of this year. But really, this event is it's not a book launch, but it's not either just about a book. This really is a project. This isn't about us conveying what we found in our research or what we heard from people back to you or back to them, but rather it's about exploring action research and how we can all better work together to advance social justice in the food systems through the various things that we do in our lives. So tonight, Nevin and I are going to present several key points from our research about urban agriculture and social justice activism in New York City. And then we'll open up a discussion with our panelists. So that's where we're headed.
Great, thanks, Kristen, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panelists for participating. Urban agriculture, as you know, is expanding in popularity by leaps and bounds and through innovative forms, from fish farms to school gardens. Urban agriculture has many benefits that intersect with environmental, community, public health, and social justice goals. The photo on the screen, by the way, is the youth farm at the High School for Public Service, which teaches about food justice along with food production. And just one of the examples of projects that are really innovative in the locations in which they exist and the issues that they are grappling with. Our research, as Kristen mentioned, really started in 2010 through our involvement as fellows with the first phase of Five Borough Farm, which was a project to document much about the state of urban agriculture in New York City. And some of our findings from that study, particularly about race and class in the urban agriculture system, really compelled us to dig deeper into social justice dimensions of urban agriculture, and this was the impetus for Beyond the Kale. Around the same time that Five Borough Farm began, New York Magazine ran a piece that hailed a number of well-known, mainly white New York City urban agriculture practitioners as, quote, the new class of growers. And although those included in the piece, including Annie Novak, whose picture is there, of Eagle Street Rooftop Farm, are also our friends and colleagues, and many are focused on social justice issues. This particular article raised concerns that the image of urban agriculture was one dominated by whites. And our interviewees in the Five Borough Farm study also spoke emphatically about racial and class disparities in the urban agriculture community, some going so far as to call New York City's urban ag system two completely different communities, one of white middle-class people and one comprising low-income people and people of color. A Kale of two cities, to paraphrase de Blasio, and with apologies to Charles Dickens. There are many puns in this field. From the standpoint of one narrative in the urban agriculture movement, that is that urban agriculture helps create more socially just systems, these comments, these findings struck us as really important observations, because if the system itself was plagued with race and class disparities, we questioned whether urban agriculture was always advancing social justice and how it might, in fact, be replicating existing inequities. And so, at the same time, we knew that there were many groups in New York City using urban agriculture as a way to advance social justice, racial justice and gender equity in particular, and that many of these were urban farmers and gardeners of color, like Abu Talib on the screen of the Taqwa Community Farm in the South Bronx. But their efforts were often, working for more socially just food, environmental, political, and economic systems, but often overlooked by those beyond their communities. As a case in point, the recent fascination with urban agriculture has tended to focus on the exotic. Rooftop farms, high-tech greenhouses, the curiosity of young affluent white college graduates taking up farming for the first time in generations, wanting to go into farming. At the same time, many successful and arguably more important, yet less flashy projects, people toiling for decades in New York City and being very successful in their communities, had difficulty getting media and funder attention. And at the moment when urban agriculture has been embraced by young affluent urbanites who have appropriated the humble vegetable kale as a symbol of foodie sophistication, we felt that it was really important to further examine the urban agriculture system in New York City to learn more about how race, class, and gender disparities affected individual groups more so than we did in the Five Borough Farm Project. And we also felt it was important to highlight the work of farmers and gardeners who are using urban agriculture to advance social justice in specific ways. And so to that end, the book project consciously features those women and men, people of color, immigrants, and other activist agriculturalists whose work has received less attention by the media, policymakers, and funders. And their work goes beyond the kale because it extends beyond the garden fence, both literally and metaphorically, through networks forged with other activist organizations. Food production's the means to a greater goal, such as dismantling racism and income disparities, and is not the sole aim of the projects. Their work transcends the trendiness of urban agriculture and the alternative food movement that's symbolized by an obsession with all things kale. And so I'll turn it over back to Kristen.
So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this project is more than a book. And as a project, we ground this work in frameworks of action research and scholar activism. And I know that many folks are not familiar with these concepts, so I thought it would be useful to give a short overview. So action research and scholar activism are frameworks through which research, analysis, writing, and other quote-unquote scholarly activities are understood as strategies that can be used to create change. These processes are iterative in terms of being planned and conducted step by step, rather than being predefined at the beginning of a project. So rather than starting out and saying, this is what we're going to be doing for the next 5 years, we're really developing each phase as it goes. They're reflexive in the sense that at each step in the process, research builds upon information and knowledge that we gain. As a case in point, we learned information in the Five Borough Farm Project that made us then need to do this additional work, really delving into people doing anti-oppression work through urban agriculture. And action research and scholar activism processes are used to inform a desired change. Action researchers use sound and appropriate research methods to gather information that is relevant to the issue at hand. And so in the case of Beyond the Kale, the intersections between urban agriculture, social justice, and political activism. Action research activities in this project have consisted primarily of interviews with many urban agriculture practitioners in New York City, including some of the folks you see sitting here before you today. Follow-up meetings, such as this one and another one that we'll be holding with the people that we interviewed in a couple of weeks. Review of key policy documents, particularly related to food and urban agriculture in New York City. Our own participation in New York City food policy making and food activism. A number of other research briefings, and then, yes, the book, which will be published by the University of Georgia Press, as I said, toward the end of this year. And public dialogues like the one that we're having tonight. So with this background in mind, we'd like to just bring up a few key points from our research that we hope will frame the discussion that we'll have in a few minutes with the panelists. And I do just want to point out that all of the urban ag practitioners who are here today have been involved in our research, and as they haven't had a chance yet to fully review all of the comments, we take full responsibility for the analysis that we're bringing before you today. And they can speak for themselves in a few minutes. So a first key point is that although the groups that we've spoken with in this research who are focused on social justice, although they conduct many common urban agriculture activities like growing food, composting, running farmers markets, on-farm education, many of the groups that we've spoken with focus on eliminating structural injustices in the food system, in addition to growing healthy food and making that available in their communities. For these activists, urban agriculture is about community empowerment and self-determination, and confronting broader issues like racism, patriarchy, and homophobia, and the socio-political systems that perpetuate those. One thing that distinguishes these groups, as far as we see, from other social welfare or community-based organizations is their recognition that food systems disparities grow out of historically inequitable power relationships that in turn convey social and economic and political advantages to some groups over others. Urban agriculture is about cultivating a different socio-political reality through food production and the various activities that grow out of it. Farms function as spaces of resistance to cultural assimilation and to connect everyday acts to broader political forces. And La Union's work, we think, is a great example of this, and we'll hear from Leticia in a few minutes about the work that they're doing in Sunset Park. Agriculture and food are means for economic empowerment as well. Farms serve as places for activist education. And the organizational structure of some of the farms and gardens that we include in this research are used as a means to empower as well. And La Finca del Sur, we don't have a representative from La Finca here tonight, but it's a farm in the South Bronx that is run collaboratively by and for women of color, and it is an example of how this is being achieved. A second key point is that the folks that we interviewed had experienced various degrees of systemic oppression, structural racism, class privilege, and homophobia particularly, in their communities. And just to break it down a little further, by structural racism, we mean those practices, conventions, and rules that reinscribe privilege based on the intersections between race and class in particular. And that individuals' abilities to forge strategic relationships with influential groups are often related to the cultural knowledge and communication styles learned throughout life as a part of upbringing, formal education, and social and professional interactions that means that individuals who are part of dominant groups often have much more opportunity to cultivate those skills and relationships with powerful individuals that over time accumulate into systemic inequity, again, based on race and class. In the context of urban agriculture, this can play out in terms of groups being led by people of color having less access to both material resources and even the personal connections with people in influential positions that people sometimes just need to get things done doing urban agriculture, particularly in New York City that has a lot of red tape, right?
And the farms and gardens in our study were engaged in policy change in ways that step beyond participation in conventional policymaking, attending community board meetings, going to City Hall to testify on the budget, and policy advocacy like lobbying decision makers to change or enact specific policy. They've developed extensive and expansive, beyond the farm gate, social change networks that are helping to do this. Urban agriculture activists are taking advantage of the convening power of food and the physical spaces they cultivate to bring groups together within their communities to influence the policymaking process by reframing the questions that people are asking, highlighting issues that may otherwise be overlooked, and thus helping to steer the policy process. By way of example, Ray Ferrero works with Friends of Brook Park. They've been creating a network of housing, environmental justice, and community development organizations that are an example of how groups are building political influence from the farm outward in their communities. Groups are influencing policy by reframing discourse, focusing attention on issues of food justice and food sovereignty, and carving out new spaces for policy advocacy. They engage in policymaking in various contexts, both inside and outside of formal governmental processes. And to many advocates, the garden or farm is a platform for engaging the community in policymaking and the practice of democracy. For many gardeners and farmers, the everyday practices that they carry out, from beekeeping to running classes for school children, challenge the status quo and conventional thinking, and often challenge the local law, and thus help to shape policies and programs. Urban agriculture practitioners have been part of a variety of research projects over the last several decades with varying degrees of satisfaction, and that's what we want to get to tonight. How can we make that a better process? Some practitioners have been wary of researchers. Many were also weary from involvement in research, including academic and government agency researchers that didn't bring any benefits to the community directly. These practitioners were reticent to participate in further research that was seen as extractive, taking and not giving back. And related to this, some practitioners were disinterested in researcher focus group events that were just a conversation without any direct outcome. And still, practitioners mentioned a number of specific topics about which they hoped researchers could help provide information, help with evaluation, project design, development, horticulture and agronomic assistance, policymaking, and effective policy advocacy. Many hoped for community-based research approaches. Several of our interviewees urged collaborative strategizing rather than simply information or idea exchange, and research that leads to tangible outcomes for organizations.
And so considering all of that, and particularly the last point, we think that there is an opening for academic institutions to work with activist urban farmers and gardeners more effectively, and as I hope we'll hear, that's already being done to a certain extent. We feel that it could happen even more effectively in support of social justice work. And this is the point that we'd like to turn to with our panelists this evening.
You mentioned social justice. You would develop some
Yes,
anti-sentiments.
I'm sure. And so we're going to have a...
better word than social justice.
Okay, that's a good, we're going to come back to that. That's actually a really good thing that I'd like to explore. We're going to have a question and answer period toward the end, and then we're going to get into some more collaborative dialogue, and I'd like to hear more about that. Thanks. So just to continue on with what I was about to say, is that truly conversations like this are very important, because we need to find a way to collaborate in such a way that it is not just academic people telling other people in the community what to do, or coming up with ideas about what we think research should mean to community members. And that's really why we wanted to have this conversation tonight with the specific panelists that we have here. And so we have some specific questions for each person and we've asked each person to limit her or his comments to 2 or 3 minutes to give a little bit of option for the other panelists to respond. And after we go through all of the questions, then we're going to get into a more open question and answer discussion period. So let's go. Oh, and I guess I'm the first question too. I'll just keep talking. So our first question is for Maggie Teeny. And we're going to give a little bit of context to each organization as we talk so that it's not just seeming like it's out of the blue for you all. So Maggie, we know that you work in a public high school and use urban agriculture to teach youth about race, class, and gender issues. And you and I have already collaborated on some educational programs that brought college students to work at the high school. So our question is, in your view, how many various collaborations with institutions of higher learning enhance your work?
So I think it's definitely, it's a tricky balance because I've had trouble with working with some institutions where they just want a lot from us and like tours and workshops, and then it's not like a real good balance. What we've done in the past with the new school is having them really conduct very concise research for us that we can use in our grants and kind of create data analysis. We've also done some work where the students actually created curriculum for our teachers at the high school. So I work at a high school in Bushwick with four individual high schools, and they all have different themes. So the high school for social justice, environmental leadership. So they actually were able to do a lot of research and go to academic conferences and create a database of curriculum for the teachers. So that was something very concrete that I told them that's all I want you to focus on, because that's what I don't have time to do as much. So it was very much a back and forth conversation where it was collaborative, and they were very open to our ideas and surveyed the teachers and stuff like that. So I think the more dialogue to have with the leaders of community organizations and farms about what it is they really, really need, and not asking too much. I think often, I'm also seeking opportunities for our students, so opportunities for them to have scholarships at these institutions. So, or, stipends or work with the schools to put some work on their resume. I think that's something that I don't see often, that I'd really like to explore is, to bridge that gap. And I also think that another area that I could see institutions helping with is kind of putting pressure on, in our case, the DOE and like the principals to really kind of legitimize the work that we're doing, because they'll listen to institutions as more than community groups sometimes. And so to really kind of be an advocate for us in that higher power realm, that they might serve a purpose. Because I know that oftentimes new principals, new teachers don't get food justice, they don't understand the work. So if there's someone in an institution who does see the value of us teaching about racial justice, teaching about food systems and oppression, I think it's really important that they voice that to the people who are in control in the DOE, to keep these programs keep going and not have them shut out.
I saw your hand up before. I want to then turn to Odalise. You're at a community college based in the South Bronx that's worked with a number of local urban agriculture groups, and Hostos is in a unique position to deepen its relationships with these groups. And you're starting a food studies program at Hostos. What do you see as the role of the community college like Hostos in collaborating with community-based agriculture groups working on social justice?
So, so I think it may make sense for me to take just a little bit of time just to kind of, for folks who don't know Hostos in general, I think Hostos Community College is part of the City University of New York, and so it's not unlike many community colleges in the country, but it's very different in that Hostos was actually a result of community mobilization in 1968. We were started by community members who mobilized so that an institution of higher education would be located in the Bronx. So it wasn't part of a sort of CUNY strategic plan to put a college there in the Bronx, but it was a result of a mobilization effort. And so we are at this juncture working on developing a formal food studies program, academic program at the college. And so I think that connecting with local community groups like urban agricultural groups who are looking at the intersection between social justice and food sovereignty, food security, and urban agriculture is extremely important for our college. And I could see a number of ways that the college would eventually be able to connect in very substantive ways to these organizations. One would be connecting with them from the academic side of the house, which would be substantively integrating some of the community-based organizations to as internship sites for our students to learn and have opportunities to study their place within the food system and to understand that from a local, state, and national level, and to really learn from the practitioners on the ground in terms of the work that you're doing, and also have the practitioners come and teach or at least present in some of our courses so that students are aware of the ongoing work in their communities. I think a second, how am I doing with time? 1 minute, okay. The second thing is we also have developed what we call a Center for Bronx Nonprofits, and so it's a group, it's an organization that is housed in our continuing education division. And again, I think that the Center for Bronx Nonprofits would seek to work with organizations within our local community that are doing this type of work to see what it is as nonprofits, what kind of special supports they would need to make their organizations salient, and so we could support them in that way. And then I think, in connection with curriculum development and faculty engagement in their own research, in action research projects with local organizations that are running. And I have to say also to capitalize on some of the comments that you mentioned, giving students who are involved in these social justice connected urban agricultural projects a way to tap into that interest and then actually formalize it as a career, for us to be a pipeline that will diversify the sector and the new knowledge generators in the industry. So that's our greatest hope.
Thanks. I guess we wanted to, does anyone on the panel want to give any response to that?
Awesome.
Okay, thanks. The next question is for Ray. You've been networking with other organizations engaged in community-based research projects, like a survey of vacant properties completed by the housing advocacy group Picture the Homeless, and you've spoken about this with us. So in your opinion, what role, if any, can academic researchers play in this work that would be helpful and not merely time-consuming for you and your activist colleagues?
Oh, man. Okay, wasn't sure who that question was being directed
Oh,
at.
sorry,
Okay.
that was for you.
All right. The question is, what role?
So I'll repeat my question.
Please.
Referring to the work that your groups have been doing with some other advocacy groups in the South Bronx, what role do you think that academic researchers could play in adding to that or collaborating in that work that wouldn't be just time-consuming for you and the folks that are doing this work on the ground?
Well, I mean, I think we could derive a lot of support. First, let me just preface my remarks by saying race and class are really deeply systemically entrenched in our society, and something that's been referred to as the political economy of structural racism. And what we've been having, that Nevin and Kristen have alluded to, is like the absence of that analysis informing initiatives or not informing initiatives. And so we have food-based initiatives that are discussing access, discussing food deserts. And really, those initiatives are not really getting at the issue within the communities that inform food security. Those issues are really informed by issues of oppression around unemployment and poverty, disproportionate unemployment and poverty. So we need to engage locals in those efforts. And so a project that would help a lot would be a survey of working class communities of color affected by structural racism, and that takes at the municipal governance and decision-making level here in the city, as it affects urban agriculture. Really specifically, we could explore things such as a structural alternative like participatory planning, a la participatory budgeting. It has been very successful. For those of you that don't know, I really commend you really looking into participatory budgeting, because it's been a wonderfully galvanizing mechanism by which heretofore marginalized communities, disenfranchised communities, economically and politically disenfranchised communities, have been able to really embrace being civically engaged in a way that respects them as experts on the issues that are impacting them. So I can go at that a little further later on, but I just also want to add that it's critically important to actively engage young people in culturally competent manner in developmentally appropriate and meaningful initiatives, such as participating in these projects, these PAR participatory action projects, such as participating in the food justice and development of food justice curriculum. At Brook Park, for example, we do something every summer known as Parables of the Revolution, the first lessons. And we talk about struggles such as the social justice struggles of the 60s and what the Black Panther Party did with its breakfast programs, and how those breakfast programs were integrally linked to the struggle, the larger struggle for social justice in those communities. So, and that's a way of grounding the urban farming work that we do. Thanks.
Thank you. Any responses? Okay, we'll keep going on then. Nick, the New York City, we'll have time for questions. Nick, we will do that in a second. The New York City Food Policy Center at Hunter College, which you founded, has published accessible reports and held forums on food policy. How might a large institution like CUNY work to make food policy making processes more equitable and accessible to urban agriculture activists and address the social justice concerns of organizations in their communities?
Sure. So the New York City Food Policy Center was created with funding from the City Council about 2 years ago. And our goals are to provide the evidence that can inform smart, fair food policy for New York, and to make that available to policymakers and city agencies, yes, but especially to groups who often don't have access to the information and evidence that's used to inform policy, and the information and evidence that can be used to mobilize communities. And I think some of the ways that we can contribute to improving food environments have sort of surprised me, because they're not necessarily what people expect going in. So I found our ability to simply have space where our school is in East Harlem. We've recently moved to East Harlem, and I'll talk in 30 seconds about our work in East Harlem. Simply to have space where people can come together and get away from the day-to-day of providing services and meeting community needs. I think in the food justice movement that I've seen, that we're all often so caught up in addressing the particular needs, we don't have the opportunity to ask the big questions. And I think universities and academics can ask some of those big questions. How is it, in the richest city in the world, we have about 1 million people who are still experiencing food insecurity, and another 1 million people, actually not another 1 million people, sometimes the same people, who are at risk of diet-related diseases because they're getting too much of certain kinds of foods. How is that, and what are the drivers at the global, national, and community level, and what are the points of intervention? And I think asking those big questions allows people to connect their day-to-day work in urban agriculture or in community projects or in trying to change retail outlets. And the last thing I'll talk about is this semester with my colleague Jan Poppendiek, who has worked many years on school food. We're teaching a course on food environments in East Harlem. And we have students from all the academic levels at Hunter, from undergraduate to master's to doctoral students. And we also have community representatives where we have been able to provide stipends to community organizations to send people to the class. And groups of 5 or 6 students and community members are investigating particular dimensions of problems facing East Harlem's food environment with the charge of identifying a problem, coming up with a solution, and enlisting existing community organizations and beginning to come to solutions. One of the projects their group is currently working on is looking to what extent do food pantries provide the foods that people with diabetes need. And East Harlem has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the city, and many food pantries are only now starting to address the particular needs of the people with diet-related diseases.
Great, thank you. Any responses from the panel? Later? Okay. So our next question is for Leticia. We know that La Union works on immigration policy reform, and you're beginning to do more work related to food and health. And we wanted to ask what kinds of collaborations with researchers, if any, would help your organization be more effective addressing intersections between immigration policy and food justice issues that the organization works on.
I feel that just by, can you hear me? Okay. That just by broadening the discourse around food, it will be a big help because based on the experiences of the members of La Unión, who are migrants from Latin America, and usually many of them were farmers before and were displaced because of trade agreements, structural economic policies, etc. So we see the connect. For us, is a reality that the food system has to do also with economic policies, globalization, with migration, and with immigration policies in the U.S., and with a lot of things, with the racial and other disparities and economic disparities. But I think if the researchers could make this case or could broaden the discourse and understanding the food system broadly, I don't know if that's a clear point. I'm trying to, I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense to you, but in my head it's like, why I haven't seen this altogether? Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, not see food like, just quality food, you know, like really the food system affects people in many ways, populations, and in many ways. So what are those impacts? And I feel that once you have that knowledge as scholars, like you have to popularize, make popular that knowledge, or try to influence with that knowledge the public discourse. Because if it's only kept in universities and in scholarly articles, etc., I feel that it will never have an impact in the real world. So I feel that it has to be also thought about how we can spread this important knowledge so that it can have an impact in policies too. And I feel that the researchers always have to ask who is the research for and for what purpose. So that's very important and not always happens in my experience. And I feel that we need to have connection between those who know certain realities by their experiences, the experiences of their lives, and those who gain knowledge through studying, through researching, etc. So I feel those relationships are extremely important. Like sometimes we are in the day-to-day or trying to do something for our communities, but we lack access, as many in the panel said, about key information. So, like for instance, in Sunset Park, where my organization is located, we see a big problem with housing. Well, we're not in New York City, right? But really, there are many things happening in Sunset Park, and we don't know, like for instance, we don't know a lot about, for instance, zoning and all that. So, what if we had these tools, you know, this knowledge about things that are affecting our lives? I feel that that's a role that institutions of knowledge can have in terms of, like for instance, right now I'm going to every Saturday, Hunter College, the School of Social Work, I think, is having a series of public policy talks where an expert is the Latino Leadership Institute who arranged for this. So we gather every Saturday and we are talking about housing policy, health policy, etc. So it's very important because it's kind of for us who are at the community, working at the community level, to have this access to these statistics, knowledge that we can after use. So I feel that there is a lot that can be done in that respect.
That's great. Thank you. And I wanted to make a comment and also invite other panel comments around some of the things that you brought up about knowledge, not only sharing knowledge, but knowledge creation, and who are researchers and who are the experts. And I think that there's a lot in there that we can continue to work on through this dialogue that doesn't see this dichotomy between researchers and community members. We all play multiple roles in life. And I think that you brought up some really important points about that. Thanks. Any other panel comments?
Isabel, you're next. The Tisch Center at Teachers College is involved with formal evaluation of nutrition education efforts and other food programs and policies. And from the perspective of the center, how might evaluation be designed and conducted so that it meets the needs of smaller activist organizations to help them grow in effectiveness and maybe scale?
The Tisch Center was, is this on? Can you hear?
It is.
It is, okay. Tisch Center was formed about a year ago, and we focus on linking both access as well as education and policy. I think we would be very happy to work with small-scale activist urban farmers in a collaborative fashion, because I think we could bring a particular process about how to do evaluation, but the group itself would be very much, they are the experts in terms of what their program is all about. And so we would help them to think through some issues of evaluation. For example, we would want to help them to think through what exactly are the objectives of their program, what outcomes do they want, and what sort of, what do they want to be accountable for, what do they want to become known for, and to be able to use for themselves. We would want to help them to think through how they might measure the impact of what that they're doing. And this might involve some kind of a survey of the group or of what they're doing. It could be involved in focus groups and in qualitative work. And we might want to help them to think through how they might think about their work in terms of what other people are doing. And I think the third thing that we could help is to help bring together different groups, because a lot of groups are doing somewhat similar things, and I think there are a lot of synergies to be obtained from that, as well as certain commonalities. So if the different groups are evaluating, maybe we could help them link with each other in terms of what their evaluation might come up with. And some of the questions and issues might be common to all of them. So that when we can pool them, then we can have a more powerful description of what it is that's effective and useful for the group. And being an academic institution, of course, we also have students who would be able to help in the process. And we definitely see it as a very collaborative process where the academics can bring some skills that they have, and the group would bring their skills, and I think together we could work together.
Comments?
Mm-hmm.
Very quiet panel. I guess you're keeping in line with our instructions.
I just want to say very, very, very quickly and tangentially, but, you know, quote, there's an Aboriginal quote from the community, the Aboriginal community in Australia. It says, if you're here to help me, please, you can take a walk, you know. We don't need your help. But if you have a destiny that you see is linked up with our destiny, then we can work together. And so, you know, I think that there's the dimension of moral incumbency that is inescapable when we talk about these types of collaborations. And we really need to really look very, very deeply, you know, at the issues that will serve as a basis for our collaboration.
Nice. Thank you. I totally agree with that. All right, so our last but not least question for you, Annette. You've suggested in some contexts that researchers in government, agencies, and academia often take more than they give. So our question is, can we change this relationship? Or what would it take on the part of researchers and activists to make relationships with research mutually beneficial rather than exploitative?
And we also hope that that can stimulate a discussion among the panelists about where do we go next?
And so first I want to acknowledge the conveners of today's program by saying thank you. It took me 13 years to get here from starting out in the community garden, so I appreciate and see this as a step in the right direction. I also want to make a public admission that I too am an academic and scholar and have great respect for knowledge, and also respect the various ways that knowledge could be accessed in the various forms of education. In my own journey, a lot of experiential courses is what I took in college so that I could make some great definitions of the world for myself. So with that said, I'm saying that what we have on the ground in our fields is a huge body of knowledge. At least 35 to 40 years of being in the same geography, on the same front lines, facing the same earth every day for, let's say, 40 or so seasons as far as New York City community garden and farm history goes, in terms of urban farming. And so most of my explanations are going to be as an urban farmer, community gardener, transitioned into urban farmer. To understand the dynamic carefully, and I'm speaking to you as fellow scholars, so I ask you to increase. To understand this dynamic, we first must observe the power line. And so we find that any occupations or any conditions that how they relate to each other will be informed by the power line. There is no way that we could look at agriculture in the United States without having, without factoring in race and gender issues and how they've affected the work that happens on the ground. And that for African people and people of color and many other peoples, the reason for being here or the journey here has something to do with agriculture or running from some form of oppression in any of our home communities. So with that, setting the stage for how I'm going to understand, you would find a community gardener appearing on the bottom of the power line and a student studying sustainable agriculture or urban agricultural, or someone's going for a PhD on the other side of the power line. You would find on the ground people who for generations have been called cooks. On the top of the power line, you will find people who have been called chefs. So we're talking about this dichotomy that is created by a power line, which is where we must start. So when my fellow panelists talk about looking at it from the formation stage, or else the whole research is erroneous, I totally agree that if we say that 1 and 1 equals 11, we will come out with some very interesting, outcomes based on that pre-assumption, which is erroneous. And so for this to work, it certainly has to be on a number of levels that this change is occurring. The change has to occur on a systemic level. So in other words, when we talk about policy, if we say that we are looking to create policy that will benefit all people and that will include people of color, we should look at the results and tally those results and see how people of color were benefited by those particular policies that said that they would. Like, that would be a really tangible way on the ground for scholars to understand whether they're creating or they're involved in cycles and cycles of creating sort of erroneous policies based on these erroneous premises. And so with that setting is how I would say we first have to fix our understandings on the problem. The issue of mutuality and reciprocity should be a natural relationship that has informed and evolved citizens operating in 2014, right? And I'm just assuming here that a part of our evolutionary codes have put us over in a place where we recognize each other's humanity. This is a great assumption on my part. I'm saying that with the humanity aspect, when you approach people on the ground, if you approach them with a power over mentality, you're going to create power over dynamics in the entire conversation. So it's like doing your homework on the ground and understanding who you're speaking to, for example. So in a project like the one that I work, where we have 35 years on the ground, where people of color have been digging trenches and growing food in New York City as an act of activism, citizenry activism, then when you come to us, you should first of all have some sensibilities that perhaps Farmer is not the, it's that the way that you speak with me and what you are presenting to me is at least intelligible, and it's not even exploitive, because I've gone through so many even discourses with intellectuals who have no idea about my background, who see me as a community gardener, not knowing that I also teach a food justice class, talking to me as the community gardener, and I may play along in that conversation, but I'm saying that this idea of mutuality and respect and humanity, like, give us the same sort of respect as you would have for yourself or whatever bodies of knowledge you are taking in from. So teaching in schools is one great way, because we're talking about economic empowerment for people below the power line. That's what this conversation means to me. Decoding some of what we understand as nutrition, because some of those bodies of works are problematic to start, and encoded in some of our greatest works are some racial issues, racial and gender issues to start, even the way that it's phrased, how it's comprised is exploitive, just reading and understanding that. So in other words, what we need to do is understand that we're looking at a revamp of a system, and we don't have an example of some point in our history where we've had a just food system, you see. So what it calls into being is really for humanity to be restored for all people, so that we could work collaboratively for the common good of all of our brothers and sisters and communities.
Thanks. Well, we have some of the leaders in the urban agriculture movement and some of the leaders in academic institutions. How do we actually dissolve or at least address this power line issue and begin to collaborate? I wonder if we can have some responses from the panel. Any suggestions? Yeah.
I think there are lots of ways in which a college can be helpful, and I think research is one way, but it goes beyond research, right? I mean, I think for what we're trying to do at Ostos, there's also the creation of spaces for study and for reflection. And so for us, what we would hope to accomplish with our program would be to provide the individuals, our students, our community members, with the opportunity to sit in a classroom and think about their lives as it relates to food and the food system, and to critique that system in formal ways, and to place those individuals at the center of both inquiry and knowledge generation around food systems, so that we are, from the bottom up, reframing the discourse, because now we're giving students the opportunity to bring their lived experiences with the food system into their education. And so I think that's another way, not just in terms of participatory action research, which is certainly important, but also creating formal spaces for people to bring their experiences and to build careers around that. And again, and I think also as a capacity builder in the community itself. You know, colleges have resources. Some of us have more than others. But, you know, just as an anchor institution in communities where we provide spaces for conversations, forums to bring together people that generally aren't brought together. So we have community activists speaking with researchers in the field around issues that have to do with social justice and food systems. Partnerships with high schools so that students have a place to bring their passions around food justice into a more formal way in their lives. So I think there's lots of ways if you really want to do it.
Great.
Start over there.
Ray, then Nick.
Well, I'd like to suggest a community organizing approach. Community organizing starts off with your hot button. What is pressing your hot button? What is in your face? What is pissing you to blip off? You know, what is not right and what is not just? And what I am suggesting by that is that, you know, we can talk about food, but it can be a very top-down paternalistic assumption that, oh, let's discuss food, let's discuss your relationship to food. That may not be the top thing that's in a person's face. Community organizing starts where folks are at, you know, and if folks are at in terms of, you know, a housing issue, you know, being in housing court, being caught up in family court, being decertified from food stamps, you know, we work with that. I'll give you, and I'm just going to give you a brief example. One year, I worked with a group of young people in Harlem. We did a participatory action research project. We had a little bit of money funded from Institute of Medicine, actually, and it was health literacy. And so we looked at all of these health organizations, and one really stood out. It was Northern Manhattan Perinatal, and they work with women that are gestating, about to give birth, just gave birth, and these are women that are HIV positive. Okay, so how do they work with these women? These are women that are dealing with a tremendous amount of stigma, so they just don't come out, and they don't come out for services, right? They don't identify themselves as being HIV, you know, living with AIDS, persons living with AIDS. And so Northern Manhattan Perinatal said, hey, let's go knock door by door. And let's introduce ourselves, and let's find out, you know, what are the issues. And so the first issue wasn't addressing the AIDS stuff. It was, you know, do you have enough benefits for your kids vis-a-vis WIC? Do you have other issues in terms of getting or not getting to a doctor's appointment? Do you have some housing issues? And so they work with them on that, ultimately establishing a relationship, a credible relationship, a trust that was the foundation for beginning to discuss some of these broader issues. So community organizing is a long-term enterprise. So we have to really be in this for the long haul, and really be, as my colleague Yonette said, be very, very deferently respectful of people where they're at. Otherwise than that, we're going to be paternalistic, and that's, you know, racism with a velvet glove on.
Did you want to respond to?
I wanted to pick up on some of the points Adalis was making about students as a resource, and my work is teaching students who are going to be health educators and nutritionists and health advocates. And I think students, particularly in health but in many other fields, come with a set of commitments, you know, of passions, of wanting to make the world better, and often are overwhelmed by the reality of what they see of the systems that have been created to meet human needs and often fail to meet those needs. And I think we academics can't always by ourselves prepare students to take that passion and turn it into a lifetime of serving people. We need you all who are working in community organizations to bring those pieces together. And whether that's through field placements or projects or courses where we bring our students into the community. And I think if we can break down some of those barriers, and we all know the stereotypes of academics of coming in to collect information and going off and publishing and never talking to anyone again. If we can break down those stereotypes and really say, together, we need to bring up the next generation and their skill and capacity in connecting people around food justice, around other social issues will depend on our doing better, tomorrow than we're doing today.
And the challenge is it's a long-term project, and students are in institutions for a short time. And faculty are often bound by grant-funded projects that are of a limited duration. But I think the challenge for us is to really develop longer-term relationships that are somewhat more like community organizing than the traditional academic models that we've been working with.
I'd like to speak to a relationship that we have with Hunter graduate students in social work. And this is a relationship that was started by Make the Road New York, who is a community partner of Eco Stations, and we do a lot of work together. So we've partnered with the Hunter students to run social action projects at the high school we're working at. And this is a long-term relationship so that we know every single year we're going to get 2 Hunter graduate students who are going to be committed and showing up 3 days a week. And this is something that is written in contracts, and it's something that they care very deeply about. And I think it's a little different working with graduate students versus undergrads, which is another discussion. But I think that, and with their help, we've been able to do a real expansion on the food justice component of our work. And they've helped us develop the Youth Food Council. So it's a youth food policy council at the school. And, and they've made connections to other institutions so that we can work on policy issues around the city and kind of rise up those youth that are leading that work. And they've kind of navigated us through that process. So I just wanted to mention that as a great example. And I also see in partnering with community groups, really seeing youth as a key component to that partnership. And these research skills they could use their entire lives. If you paid high school students to run these research projects, and they therefore train their other students and are developing these different databases that then they can even teach undergraduates about. They can come to the undergraduates and teach them what they've learned in that whole process. And my students that I'm working with, they're doing lots of surveys around the high school so they can develop their food council focus. And they're incredibly skilled at this because they know, how to ask students the right questions, how to do the on-the-ground work, the community organizing, and really push movements forward because they're in it. So I think there's a lot to be learned through them as, on-the-ground activists and researchers in their everyday life. And also a lot that we can learn from the institutions if that conversation is very open. And also, the commitment, the long term, is very important.
Any other comments? Yannette?
Yeah, and so on the ground, I am very aware that skepticism or any other ism is not something that flies in due to an imaginative process. And so if we understand how isms are formed and schisms are formed, mostly they return us to studying our own history of behavior patterns, right? So I don't know how many people have heard, there's a statement that says what government likes, it adopts. I mean, has anybody in the room heard that? I mean, if they really like it, it might adopt it. And so, in other words, ideas that are meant for communities that may not be able to prosper because of the economic rift. So as a community leader, you might see that same idea go full blast because there is the economic support or back it. And you know very well that those ideas were birthed probably through a process that called itself democratic and community-based. So that was what I wanted to bring back as a place for us to think about poles, if we could situate these poles and move between these two poles to understand more about how we could do this work and what mutuality means to people on the ground. For children of color, again, who have become food for many institutions. I mean, food, quote unquote, food mean unendless target population, like unendless, like we will teach you to death. I mean, the teaching, like you are obese and the problem probably is food, so you must need some exercise and some good vegetables to solve this problem of obesity. And so as life unfolds, we understand that there are many other aspects, meaning violence in the environment could be a major contributor to the endocrine systems and the regulation systems that were given to us naturally that control how food is assimilated into our bodies. And then we must rethink what is our message that's out there and how is that connected to inequality or something else that we might have been perpetuating in the past. And I'm just serving as a moral conscience right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing that into the conversation. I think we're almost to the point where we want to do audience discussion, but I wanted to give Leticia or Isabel a chance to say anything else since you've been quiet.
Yeah, I just want to complement with what Yvette said, that, it's not only knowledge, right? I was talking about like the zoning and all the things, but really it's a big battle. Like we feel as people of color and facing many challenges that it's not easy to achieve this change, like sometimes we may have, I think, what if we get all the knowledge about certain processes, but then the system doesn't keeps operating in the same way in which you really don't have a voice, don't have power, don't have a seat at the table where decisions are made. Everything is pretends to be democratic, but really you don't have that same, you are not at that level of really creating that change. So I feel that really our work together means so much more, and in terms of kind of how do we bring justice to these places? How do we have a real impact in our real lives?
And the farm, the garden could be a place to begin those conversations. The food production could be a means to have those discussions about these broader issues of power imbalances and race and class oppression. Isabel, do you want to make any comment? Okay. Let's open it up now to the audience. You've been sitting here patiently. Any questions or comments? Please try to be concise if you're asking a question, and we'll have the panelists respond. Yes.
I have a question, maybe for Isabel or anyone else, just about evaluation. Ray spoke, your last comment was about kind of being receptive to needs of the community and how sometimes those needs change. And in my experience, a lot of organizations realize the need for evaluation because they're trying to fulfill grant requirements or have specific evaluation needs that are set by foundations that can often be quite specific. I was wondering, with the groups that you work with, to what extent do you feel like organizations are limited by evaluation and by the kind of things that funders want to see evaluated, and then maybe the flip side, to what extent do you think that evaluating
Well, I think you raised some very interesting and important questions, because if it is a funded project, then usually you have to tell them up front what you think you're going to, what your purpose is, and then you're held accountable to see whether you bring out some results. That is a dilemma, but I think that another way to go is really doing an evaluation as opposed to just sort of like a experimental study. And in that case, then you can do it much more to find out whether it is beneficial to the group themselves as well as to other groups, because I think it has to serve the groups themselves as to what can we learn, what lessons can we learn to make our work better for the future, and that we can help to collaborate with other people. Depending on where you get the money from, sometimes there's a lot more latitude than you think there is in terms of doing other things other than just what the one things that they ask you for. So I think you can go beyond the limits of what you are given. You want to add to that?
I guess my center is evaluating a neighborhood healthy food program that LISC, which is a support group for community development corporations, is sponsoring with 5 community development corporations in low-income communities. And the Healthy Food Initiative is a combination of improving food environments, retail food environments, nutrition education, and integrating food into a variety of programs. And I think what we're hoping is, and yes, the foundation that's funding them wants to know, well, you know, what's the result? What's happening? And I think that's a fair question for everybody. You need to know that what you're doing is improving the lives, because not only are you spending money, but you're taking up the time of people. And you want to know that that's time that will benefit them and lead to reductions in the overwhelming problems that are facing many communities. But I think at best an evaluation can be a platform where the people who use a program and the people who staff it and the people who management can talk about what their vision of that program is, and then you can reconcile those different visions and test them out against what's actually happening. And then by feeding that back, give the opportunity to users, participants, frontline staff, and managers to make that program better. And that's hard.
And so with that question brought to my awareness were a number of issues: asset-based community organizing styles versus need-based community organizing styles. So we understand that philanthropy is mostly using the needs-based model at this point. We also understand that philanthropy is actively engaging in discussions to understand how they could also address this issue. And so what I see there, even in terms of metrics that need to be changed, like who decides that these are the metrics that we should use in our communities? And how does that tie into non-traditional educational settings? Our non-traditional educational settings, so in other words, when I use my farm as an outdoor learning center, are my goals the same as the university that you may have needed your privilege to get through the, are we having this, are we all on the, is there a set model that has to fit us all, and why?
So my name is Gustavo Citrini, and I'm a professor of food studies at NYC's program. And I wanted to start by saying that I absolutely agree with everything I think I've heard from the panel about the extractive nature of academic research, about the possibility and the need for collaboration. I was particularly sort of gratified and excited to hear the specific recommendations for the kinds of research, because I'm a political scientist, and I think those issues of power and food, and how food is sort of just one facet of the different power struggles that the communities that you represent are involved in. But I thought what was missing from the discussion was a little bit more of the perspective of academic. And I wanted to pick up on this Aboriginal proverb, because I think one of the real problems is that the destinies of academics and community organizations are really not entwined.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the incentives, and I can speak to the academic part. It has to do with the incentives that academics have and the sort of demands that are placed on them by their institutions. And as much as I'm really aware of the privilege that I've had, people like me have had, being part of elite academic institutions, there's also a power hierarchy within academia. And the sorts of academics that are coming to community organizations, particularly the young academics who are interested in these questions, are at the very bottom of that hierarchy. Particularly given the sort of labor market crisis in academia, they're the least likely to get jobs. And even in a field like political science, which is sort of very interested, or ought to be interested in questions of social activism and justice, there's not any sympathy for participatory action research. It is the people who decide whether you keep your job don't think it's valuable. And so there's a struggle that has to go on the other side that, when someone comes to you, you may not even be aware of that.
Thank you.
And so I think while I agree with everything I've said, I think that there's some really sober realities about the narrowness of the space in which we're trying to construct those. So.
Very good comment.
Yeah, I think actually I want to respond to that too, and thank you very much for bringing that up. Perhaps another part of this question that is missing from our discussion here is what makes it, what you've kind of talked about, what makes it difficult for people based in academic institutions to do the work that they see as needed and to listen to folks and actually go forward with that. And not just, what I'm getting at here is I guess much of what you've said, not just from kind of an institutional perspective, but the fact that the people, younger academic folks or junior academic folks are people too. And we also have constraints. And so maybe we needed to have a question up here about that dynamic that also kind of helps break down this hierarchy that everybody in an academic institution has a lot of power and people who aren't in academic institutions don't have power. So maybe that's a question that we need to add to our next discussion. Thanks.
Yes, that's a very, and that hierarchical structure is brought home every day in academia. There are institutions, I think the institutions here have a commitment to supporting action research and community-based research. Of course, it's not always honored during the tenure review process. It depends, and that's a risk that academics have to take in their own career and their own lives, as community activists have to take in deciding what's important to do in one's life. And I think that one of the challenges that we face is to try to change the culture of academic institutions that in a way that we're trying to change other kinds of institutions like the New York City Council or corporate organizations. And that work has to involve a form of community organizing, I think, within academia as well, and support among academics who are doing this work. It's certainly not an easy challenge, but it's, I think, something that there seems to be a growing cadre of university-based academics, researchers who are not in academic institutions, and activists that can actually coalesce and actually move this work forward. Maybe that's a Pollyannish or optimistic view of things, but I think I think there are enough of us who are committed to really trying to move forward with the kind of research that we think is really important and that communities feel is valuable, irrespective of the outcomes for our tenure review 6-7 years hence. Any other responses to that? Because that's, I think, a critical mention. We can't simply say that.
Well, I want to give an example, which is just to lighten up maybe the discussion a little bit, which is a colleague of mine who is in nutrition science. So he actually did all his publishing and all that in the basic nutrition sciences. And the day after he got his tenure, he says, actually, I'm not interested in nutrition science at all. I'm interested in gardens and urban agriculture, and that's what I'm going to do all my research from now on. And he was able to get away with it. So I don't know, maybe you can do it in one area, and then when you get your tenure, do something that you really want to do.
Any other questions from the audience? Comments? Yes.
My name is Krista, and I'm a community educator and organizer, and I have a question for you who are very active in the community. So it has been stated that this urban gardening, the face of it has been very white and middle class. And my question would be, how can all of us in our various spaces of influences really be advocates for the community organizations of color and raise that visibility so that it doesn't continue as just a white middle class movement?
Well, just revisiting community organizing as a paradigm for moving the project for social justice forward, in this case, food justice, food sovereignty. You know, the word justice and sovereignty, you have to unpack that a little bit. Is food just in and of itself? Is food sovereign in and of itself? No. These terms refer to people, and they are terms that are really rooted in a frame of human rights. So when you take that frame, use that frame, you're really being very respectful of people's human rights to be productively engaged, regardless of their dislocation, structural dislocation from the labor market, regardless of their poverty status, that people are still human beings. So taking that and, you know, really going to where folks are at. What we're doing at the New York City Community Garden Coalition, the New York City Community Garden Coalition, if I may say, I have a couple of colleagues here, you know, we were born out of struggle. That's why I alluded to earlier, the community organizing model is always, what's in your face? What is pressing your hot button? In this case, gardens were being auctioned off, they were being destroyed, they were being bulldozed, and folks said, oh, we got to get together. We can't let this happen. So, you know, we had a very glorious period in which we were able to mount a wonderful, wonderful struggle with some very significant victories around the preservation of gardens. That has been an ebb and flow since that time. We're talking in the early 2000s, you know, where we had, if you will, a very cresting of the movement in terms of its victories. So it's been a real ebb and flow. And so we kind of got complacent. But now, you know, particularly Bloomberg sort of woke us up, the Bloomberg administration, that is, and in terms of the big push for really discriminating against poor communities and people's right to full participation in the structures of governance when it comes to disposition of land resources, for example. Well, anyway, just to get to get out to the community gardens. Get out and meet with community gardens and just commune with community gardens. Community gardens are wonderful places where the neighbor is brought back into the hood, whereby, as the name suggests, community, bringing the community back, you know, into gardening. It's where, you know, we're drawing, as Janet alluded to earlier, the assets of the community. You know, there is social capital that can be cultivated, that can be harnessed, and that can be directed in a way that is very, very productive, even to the point that my colleague from La Union was making about, oh man, this intractable issue around power and these institutions. Well, we have to start with the people, go to the people. I highly recommend visiting us at the New York City Community Garden Coalition General Meetings. Our general meetings during the warmer times happen out in community gardens and in communities. So that's a wonderful way to go at this and to begin. You know, it's a wonderful place to be in. And it's where how we do our base building. It is a challenge, you know. Base building requires it's very labor intensive. Community organizing is very labor intensive, very energy intensive. But notwithstanding, we are looking at cross-coalitional kinds of stuff to kind of mutually leverage resources from other sister social justice organizations, such as Picture the Homeless, such as Community Voices Heard. We were incidentally, actually, this past Monday at a city council hearing on governance. This Community Voices Heard, New York City Community Garden Coalition was there talking about some of the very issues that you were raising. So it can be done. It's a step-by-step, walking the road with people.
I think it's one of the most innovative things that you've been doing is reaching out to organizations that are dealing with housing, environmental justice, community development issues. That's really building a power base.
I just want to say that, for example, homeless folk, if you're homeless, that's like, whew, you have food security issues. It's not just, this housing is a human right, but there's also food issues there. But for us, strategically organizing with Picture the Homeless, because community gardens, we've gotten this policy pushback, this governmental pushback, this real estate pushback, we need affordable housing. And you all know what a subterfuge that has been here in New York City. It has not really, affordable housing as it's defined, and for those of you that are urban planners know what I'm referring to in terms of how that's determined, has not been really affordable. And so we with the community of Picture the Homeless realize that. And so we invited them to our forum last year to partake of our annual shindig around community garden, but to really begin to talk about, issues of common, cross-cutting issues of common interest here, and that is the human rights of people to have affordable food as much as affordable housing.
So we have time for one more question, and then we will break for informal discussion and some refreshments. So would anyone like to ask the last question? Okay. With that, let's thank the panelists in the conventional way. Thank you all for coming, and as I said, we have some refreshments outside, and we'll be around to have informal conversations. Thanks.
Okay, sure.
We only scratch the surface. That always happens.
What's that?
We only scratch the surface.
Oh, I know.